everyone. Good evening. I still see some folks coming in. Thank you for being here tonight. My name is Amanda Hunt. I'm the head of public engagement, learning, and impact here at the Walker Art Center. Thrilled to have an incredible artist here in our city for the second time in her life, and to share her work with you all. But first, we'd like to start by acknowledging that the Walker Art Center and the Minneapolis Sculpture Garden are located on the contemporary, traditional, and ancestral lands of the Dakota people. This site, which was once an expanse of marshland and meadow, holds meaning for the Dakota, Ojibwe, and indigenous people from other Native nations who still live in community today. I'd also like to acknowledge and thank Nancy for her ASL interpretation tonight. And before we begin the program in earnest, I'd like to especially thank Aaron and Carol Mack for their generous support of the Mack Lecture series. This is the first in a few years. It's good to be back. Sadie is an artist near and dear to me. She's a friend, and I'm so happy again to have her here with us tonight. Sadie Barnette lives, works, and is from Oakland, California. She has her BFA from Cal Arts and an MFA from the University of California, San Diego. She's mounted solo exhibitions at the Kitchen, New York, Pomona College in Los Angeles, and Pitzer College Art Galleries, the ICA Los Angeles, the Lab in San Francisco, the Museum of the African Diaspora in San Francisco, MCA San Diego, and many others. I'm gonna have to tighten it up so we can get to the talk. She's done a lot. Recent commissions include Bay Area walls at SF MoMA and a permanent site-specific installation at the Los Angeles International Airport coming in 2024. Barnette's work is included in current group exhibitions across the country, including the Oakland Museum of California. Her work is in the permanent collections at LACMA, at the Brooklyn Museum, the Perez Art Museum in Miami, the Guggenheim in New York, the Blanton in Texas, so on and so forth. She's the recipient of numerous grants. It was a pleasure to read through this, and residencies, including the Studio Museum in Harlem, where we did a lot of great work together. Art Matters, Skowhegan School of Painting and Sculpture, the Headland Center for the Arts, and she was also the inaugural Artist Fellow at UC Berkeley's Black Studies Collaboratory. Sadie's multimedia practice illuminates her own family history as it mirrors a collective history of repression and resistance in the U.S., the last born of the last born, and hence the youngest of her generation. Barnette holds a long and deep fascination with the personal and political value of kin. Her adept materialization of the archive rises above a static reverence for the past. She offers a history that is alive. Her drawings, photographs, and installations collapse time and expand possibilities. Political and social structures are a jumping-off point for the work, but they are not the final destination. Her use of abstraction, glitter, and the fantastical summons another dimension of human experience and imagination. Please join me in welcoming Sadie Barnette to the stage.
Hello, everybody. I want to thank you so much for joining us tonight. I know we all have various obstacles that you got to get through to get to a space and share space together. So thank you for whatever challenge you overcame or are still overcoming while you are here together. I also want to thank those that came before me, both on this land and before me in my profession, my ancestors, and my family. And just to kind of tell you, a little bit about myself, I guess the quickest kind of way that I situate and locate myself is to say that I'm born and raised in Oakland, in California. I use drawing, photography, sculpture, installation, wallpaper, couches, really whatever I need to use in order to tell my family story, and hope that it will also relate to some of your family stories, and that people can see, history with like a capital H in a kind of more familial and locatable within our own stories kind of way. So that's one thing that I hope my work does, but I also do this work just because it's my way of moving through the world and my way of making sense of the world. And it's just who I am and how I think. And I feel so lucky that I was able to find and make a job for myself in this world that allowed me to do those things in the weird way that I do them. I'm gonna try to run through some projects, speak for about 45 minutes. I hope you guys will make yourselves comfortable. If you need to take a deep breath, if you need to laugh, cry, get up, walk around, do your thing, and I'll do my thing. I guess the last thing I like to say is that, me talking about the work is not the work itself. It points to the work, circles around the work, and kind of gets close to the work, but it's my hope that there are going to be certain things that you would, feel and experience that can't be explained or described and that really exist beyond language. But I think that these talks can be a really good kind of welcoming and entry point into the work. And then, hopefully people can have their own experience. So I'm not going to be able to sum it all up. I hope there will still be some mystery and questions and kind of unexplainable things. So I guess I'm kind of, in a way, going from most recent and working backwards in some ways, but I wanted to start with this image. It's actually on view currently in San Francisco at the McAvoy Foundation. But I thought this would be a good way to kind of overall paint, the way that family operates in my work. So this piece is entitled Family Tree, and it really is like a deconstructed family tree. So if you see some of the text pieces, they are basically self-portraits, but through naming my family and my ancestors. So the first one on the very left, the red drawing says Cassandra's great-great-granddaughter. I am that person. There are also thousands of other people who are the great-great-granddaughters and even many more greats of Cassandra. And then moving along, you have Agnes and Samuel's great-granddaughter, Laverne and Sadie's granddaughter. And so it's really this kind of mapping out of who I am in relation to where I come from. And then you have woven in and out photographs. Some of these photographs are things I've just snapped on my cell phone, or photographs I've found in my auntie's shoeboxes of photos, things I've shot around Oakland or at family reunions. And they're kind of, peppered in with these family names. And this is really the texture of what it is to be family, to break bread, to eat French fries, to, have a birthday cake with your name on it. And then it sits with this holographic glitter couch to really bring some of this world to real life. There's a detail. And so the drawings are spray paint with the white being the negative space of the paper. There's also some pencil drawings. There's rhinestones on various photographs, stickers, collages. Again, I'll just kind of use whatever I need or whatever the idea needs to get to the heart of the matter. And then the photograph with everyone wearing pink shirts. I'm not sure if you can see it, but there are these shirts that say Sweet Sadie that my dad kind of secretly made for a bunch of my family to show up to one of my exhibitions with these shirts. So there's a lot of behind the scenes then becomes the scene, and the reference then becomes the thing, and it all kind of gets blended together. And so the first project that I really want to delve into, I call it the FBI project. Basically, in 2011, my family filed a Freedom of Information Act request to find out what FBI surveillance there was on my father, specifically during his time in Southern California. He founded the Compton chapter of the Black Panthers, and then a few years later, his time in Northern California working closely with Angela Davis to secure her freedom when she was on trial. And we really had no idea what we would find, but after about 5 years of going back and forth with the FBI, we finally received 500 pages of really intense surveillance and much more than that, which I'll get into. This is a little project description. I think I'll read it just so I don't forget to get any of the essentials in there. And kind of, this also points to like my mood, I think, of approaching this project. So it says, when I first studied the 500-page FBI surveillance file amassed on my father, Rodney Barnette, I thought, damn, I'm lucky he's alive, that he lived to tell, that I was born. My second thought was, make this art, make this do something. I needed to turn this dossier of repression into a testimonial for my father, for the story, for the struggle. Trusting in my rigorous yet playful aesthetic of minimalism, restraint, and color, I started making collages and drawings that appropriated the official documents. I wanted to reclaim them and make them live in my world. I did not do this to put a pretty bow on the history of the 60s, but to rage pink light over the entire ever-expanding fuckery of how humans keep behaving. And that's obviously a photo of me and my dad. So a bit of backstory on my father. He was born in Medford, Massachusetts in 1944. He was drafted and eventually sent over to Vietnam in 1966, which is the photograph on the left. The photograph on the right is 2 years later in 1968. And this, again, these are family photographs that actually my cousin took as like a young teenager, but it just so perfectly captures this dynamic that we have after, you know, almost every war, and kind of maybe less in these like forever wars and technological wars. But you have this thing where generations of Black and brown, at that time men, are coming home from military service and, you know, have lost limbs and loved ones and nearly died and come back to no greater rights or dignities than, you know, they previously had in this country. And so you'll often see, you know, an upsurge in organizing and in people demanding their rights and, you know, in the aftermath of a war. And so my father talks about basically coming home from the war. He went to Compton, California to bury his nephew who didn't make it through the Vietnam War. And he says he felt like he was still at war because of the raids that the cops and the sheriff's department was doing in Compton, California. And it felt like things that, you know, would have been illegal in the war were still happening in the Black community. So that's why he joined the Black Panthers. And he was only in the Panthers for about a year, basically due to what we later learned was a lot of infiltration and, you know, the government's undoing and unraveling of the relationships and work of the party. And we found so much of that in this FBI file. You know, I think to call it a surveillance file kind of sounds like maybe it's just this innocuous information collecting, but it's so much more than that. It's intimidation, harassment, it's fomentation of personal relationships, you know, pulling marriages apart, agent provocateurs, coercion, and even, as we know today, assassination. These photographs sit on this wallpaper. You can see the stamp in the top right corner reads racial insect. So this is like the racial intelligence section. And I was just definitely thinking about, like, you know, this is so systematized that this is an actual stamp on hundreds of FBI desks all across the country. And then there's been a lot of different iterations of how I've approached the working with the source material. I tried to really listen to the material and keep investigating and keep digging deeper and have recently kind of gotten larger and let these documents take up more space. So I'm going to walk through this exhibition a bit. This was from 2021. It was a 2-site exhibition at the Benton Museum at Pomona College, and there's a book that came out with this exhibition. And the structure basically was these 12 large-scale drawings, and the sculpture in the center of the gallery was one of the sites of the exhibition. And this sculpture is essentially, it's called Home Good Centerpiece. It's a found and altered coffee table with mirror, plex, and wood inlay, and these glitter surveillance cameras, and then a vase of fresh red roses placed on top. So obviously you could see in some of my other work that I'm really interested in the living room as this space of kind of protection and creating family and culture and traditions, but also thinking about, you know, the kind of lack of safety that it's supposed to be a private space, but we know that it's not private because the door could be kicked down at any moment, and, you know, the neighborhood could be gentrified at any moment. And so, you know, who is not in the living room with us, who should be, who we lost to state violence or incarceration. So the living room, while it has this kind of promise of protection and coziness, and we make it that when we can, there's also, you know, these surveillance cameras kind of peeking out and reminding us that we're not, you know, our magic spells that we're casting are not necessarily keeping out this gaze. But I was also thinking with, you know, making these glitter surveillance cameras about a kind of like scrambling of the technology, and maybe restorative technology, a counter surveillance against some kind of magic spell that, you know, in my mind would come from this place of love that would be somehow powerful enough to undo this like state apparatus. And so then the drawings, these are like 5 feet by 6 feet high. I realized that, you know, this material could really hold a lot of space and weight. So again, kind of underscoring that this is about reclamation and restoration, really making these drawings large. And the way they're made is out of powdered graphite on white paper. So wherever you see white is like the negative space that's been masked off, and everything else is like this deep, dark graphite. It's really inverting the pages from how they looked when I received the documents. So again, kind of trying to flip it and change, you know, the intent of the document by kind of, also I feel like it kind of looks almost like a carbon copy or these sort of ghost-like presences. The screen is a little bit darker, so if you're seeing this in real life, there's a bit of kind of cloudiness and texture. And if you can imagine, instead of like a glowing screen, the surfaces are kind of absorb light and are quite deep and dark. But because it's graphite, there's also a bit of a sheen and a metallicness to the surface. Another thing that you would probably do if you saw the drawing in person is you kind of get up really close to it and try to see if it is in fact handmade or a print. And so you're kind of doing this, like getting closer and farther away. This particular drawing is called Do Not Destroy. This stamp, you know, came on the FOIA when we received these documents. And to me, it's just very interesting to think about kind of subverting that language and being like, well, do not destroy us, or do not destroy, you know, a movement and historical value. Again, all these things, like from the language of the FBI, can I kind of, you know, make them exist in my world, and, you know, what does it feel and sound like to say these words through my lens, looking back, you know, 50 years later at these documents. This drawing is called Informants, and you can see like all these redactions and then LAT2, LAT3. This is how informants were listed in the document, and I've used spray paint on top of the drawing, definitely thinking about spray paint, tagging, graffiti, me being like an 80s baby generation, thinking about claiming space or reclaiming something by kind of leaving your mark on it. And the spray paint kind of just sits on top of these really detailed drawings. So there's an element that's very controlled and precise, and then there's an element that's a bit more wild and random with the spray paint. And with the thinking about informants, I think there's been a lot more media and history and storytelling that's come out recently that really begins to understand, the depths of the infiltration and the informants and the coercion. And there's a book by Betty Metzger that I really recommend if anybody's interested. It's called The Burglary, and it's about the breaking in to an FBI office in Media, Pennsylvania by concerned citizens, which really exposed COINTELPRO. And even to this day, I think it's because of those anti-war activists that broke into this FBI office that we even know about this. But she describes that the FBI basically under COINTELPRO saw two types of Black Americans who should be surveilled and Black Americans who should be used to surveil other Black Americans. And there's just so many statistics and facts that show how systematic it was and just how intense it was. There was a particular moment where every Black student at Swarthmore was under surveillance. Not every student that was organizing, not every Black student that was in an organization, but just every Black student. And this drawing is called Former Members. You can see all these roses have been added on top of the existing material. This is really my intervention in thinking about these redactions and maybe my own redaction, my own level of, an undetectable secret code that the FBI wouldn't be able to understand, or, a code that wouldn't be able to be cracked. Also thinking, in this case, the flowers are coming out of this, text that reads former members. Most of these members are, deceased, and that's why they're being called former members. But really thinking about these flowers as a way to mourn and memorialize and to add life, to suggest evidence of, the domestic rituals of care. And I think that, public opinion about the Panthers has changed somewhat favorably in maybe the past 5 or 10 years, but there really hasn't been any actual repair to the families that were harmed and separated by the state-sanctioned violence. So even thinking about somebody like Mumia Abu-Jamal, who has such a huge profile, is still incarcerated. Somebody like Erica Huggins, who also has an amazing book out now about the Black Panther women. It's a photography book with Stephen Shames. There's been no reparations for the loss of her husband. And I really think that in some ways, these drawings are kind of me casting spells for healing and justice, and certainly an evidence of a fierce love. This is just a detail to kind of show you the pixelated information. When I received the FBI file, it wasn't a dusty banker's box. It was a CD-ROM because it was 2015. And so in a way, it was just strange, but also definitely made me think about, how much technology has changed surveillance, and thinking about the kind of just exponential digital surveillance that's happening now, especially, to young activists. And then, so that's why you see the pixels, even though this information is pre-digital. And then with the roses, I kept them very smooth, so they kind of come from their own world, separate from the digital information. There's other times where the whole page is almost redacted. I feel like that negative space kind of holds a lot, even though it says nothing. And these particular rose pattern, I was really thinking about, again, like a wallpaper, a fading kind of domestic space and wallpaper. And I really feel like drawing these, by hand and really laboring over this graphite, working it into the paper really gives me time to meditate on the bravery, the politics, the people, and the real lives. I think for me, my interest in the 60s and 70s, it's really not like hypothetical or an aesthetic. I think there's just so much at stake, so much to learn from, and so much that we still don't actually understand about what was happening and what the Panthers were kind of manifesting and how many community service programs there were and people just taking care of each other. And to me, it really feels like a family project. It feels like, free breakfast programs and ambulance programs and protecting people from getting evicted. Like, these are things that you do for your family. And so to me, I really see this this deep care and a fierce care that I don't think is often remembered. J. Edgar Hoover famously said the most dangerous part of the Black Panther Party was the free breakfast program, because what, could better galvanize the hearts and minds of a community than by like providing food and showing that like the current system is not working if children aren't getting fed before school. Even now, the reason we have free lunch programs in schools is because then the government kind of co-opted and adopted this practice so that it wouldn't be quite as shameful, although we know a lot of that is getting rolled back. So I'm gonna keep kind of moving through these drawings, but this one is just like a very brief moment of my dad and Angela Davis at the Chicago airport, and it's one of those pages where the information is small, but it feels so ghostly, like this moment captured almost like a photograph or a moment just caught in amber, reading about it in this file. Here's another detail of how the drawing or the roses kind of interact with the material. These are some Hello Kitties. This page is really like the information on the file is talking about surveilling the Black Panther newspaper and passing it around to identify people based on photographs or who's writing articles. And really, the Panthers were so adept at visual culture and the importance of information. And so it just makes a lot of sense to me that, the media would be surveilled. And I thought these Hello Kitties could kind of swarm in and be this like people's army again, kind of scrambling the system. And also as like this youthful young kid kind of looking to protect my father with like what I would have, which would be like an army of Hello Kitties. And sometimes they got like these really weird, cool, kind of sinister shapes, designs. And yeah, here, this is the only image in the whole file was this mugshot of my father. He was never convicted of anything, but he would get dragged down to, the courthouse every now and then to get, I think at some point it was to get a photograph of him. So there's a couple moments that he thinks this might have been from and kind of tried to piece it together looking back. But, my experiment was like, can I take a mugshot, something that's really meant to dehumanize and kind of instantly criminalize somebody? If I make this with my own hand in my aesthetic, can it be transformed into a portrait of a father and of, someone fighting for freedom and dignity, and can that somehow be restored in this image? It's a detail of the spray paint. It's a little like hot, brighter red in real life. And then I want to kind of switch gears to a few other ways that I work. So this is a photograph from an exhibition I did at the end of last year at Jessica Silverman Gallery, who I work with in San Francisco. And there's a lot of color and family and kind of delight and sparkle in this work. I really think about these spaces as like rooms for magic and possibility and dreaming, and spaces that pay tributes to the kind of everyday moments of beauty and hospitality and togetherness that we manifest even amidst everything that we're up against. So this is like a pink tinted window. There's a wallpaper, a couch, photograph, these speaker stacks. These are like candy painted speakers, so like basically the same paint that you would use on cars. You know, being a Cali girl, car culture was just always like a way that people kind of express themselves, announce themselves, tell you about themselves, even though car is just such a like functional thing. It's just supposed to get you from point A to point B. But in reality, like the style and swagger of how you're getting from point A to point B is kind of what makes up like the actual texture of life. So I work with a car painter in LA who paints these speakers for me and like has come up with some new fun colors and really got into the project. I'm definitely thinking about like tools for communication and amplification of like culture and music. I also am really influenced by music, and if I could choose would probably be a musician but have no musical ability. So I kind of make these silent tributes to music, and even though they're silent, they feel kind of loud. This is that wall behind the pink. So when you're outside, it looks like it's a pink room if you're looking in, but then you get in there and you're like, oh, it's white. It's just, you know, the way I was looking at it or the perspective of the window made it seem pink. So again, these holographic couches that I've been using and really thinking about, like the plastic that maybe your grandma might have on her couch, and this idea of sort of preserving something, keeping something beautiful for later, I love. But then I use this very holographic vinyl plastic, so it feels almost like future grandma, kind of some type of like time loop, or this like maybe living room from the future where there's like more safety and dignity. The wallpaper behind it says sister. And then the photograph is my Auntie Viv, chilling in a space. My understanding is that she sewed like the couch covers and like, you know, this was her space that she made. I love how living rooms are very, it's kind of like the presentation space. It's private, but it's like what you want, you know, people to know about you when they come in to your space. Elizabeth Alexander writes really beautifully about the living room space in her 2004, I think, book of essays, The Black Interior. That's been something that has really helped me find the language of why I'm so obsessed with these living room spaces. But, you know, she's got like this oil painting hanging on the wall, and like she's lounging with her feet up, which probably didn't, you know, happen that often because she was like working hard. But I just love this moment. And all those little black dots are actually rhinestones, which are kind of impossible to photograph, but in real life, it just twinkles kind of subtly as you walk by. And then this is the drawing that wallpaper came after. So this is a colored pencil drawing. It's the same size as the FBI drawing, so it's like 60 inches high by 48 inches wide, and it's all colored pencil on paper in this repeating pattern with the word sister. So again, I'm thinking about family and kin, but also the kind of, you know, political or social connotations of like sisterhood and who is your sister at what time and under what circumstances, and, you know, all of that in like this fairly small word, which is why I love working with text. It can be so specific, but yet so open and kind of do a lot with a little. And this is a detail. You can kind of see where there's like some actual texture of the colored pencil, but it feels, even in real life, kind of obsessively perfect that maybe it isn't a drawing, and then if you get really close, you can see that it is. And then the last project that I want to talk about is one that is very near and dear to my heart and is fun and wild and hilarious and weird and continues to teach me about what art can do and what I can do. And so this is the new Eagle Creek Saloon. It was commissioned by this super cool space in San Francisco called The Lab in 2019. And essentially, it is a participatory installation that reimagines my father's bar, which was the first Black-owned gay bar in San Francisco. And I built this structure. It's part monument, part altar, really in an effort to reanimate the bones of the Eagle Creek in an intergenerational revival. I didn't want to make a project about the bar. I knew that I needed to make a project that was the bar. And just really, to give you the background of it, my dad opened the bar in 1990, really to serve a multiracial gay community, his friends, who were marginalized by the very covert and overt racist profiling practices of San Francisco's queer bar scene. So it wasn't just that he always had a dream of running a bar. It was the indignity that he and his friends would face at the white gay bars in San Francisco that would turn, what's supposed to be a cute night, flirtatious, fun outing into infuriating reminders that no scene apparently is safe from racism and vitriol. And my dad basically says, there were certain bars that he just was I can't go back to these bars because someone's going to get hurt or arrested. And so he had to make a bar. And I love thinking about that kind of placemaking in the lineage of my father's activism. To me, this bar was very much that. It was protecting people, whether it was protecting Angela Davis during her trial or, protecting the community with Panther patrols or making a bar. To me, it's very much who he is, even in these very different moments. So yeah, the bar was basically, my dad calls it a community center that happened to serve alcohol. They would celebrate Black holidays and heroes. They would participate in the historic Market Street vigils that would happen. They would close the bar and go out to the street when there was vigils for those lost to AIDS. This was 1990, so really a lot of, was lacking in the government's response to the situation, and people were educating each other and taking care of each other and figuring it out together and organizing around awareness together. And so the slogan of the bar was a friendly place with a funky bass for every race. It's so 90s and so amazing. And so, yeah, this project, the intent is to introduce the Eagle Creek into existing channels of histories and queer histories, but also it really manifests its own archive, which recognizes the limits of official histories and celebrates the unknown and the unknowable and the unnameable. So first, I'm just going to kind of show you how this was constructed. It was constructed deeply with love to be shiny and fun and also really strong and tough and actually be used and danced on and, to be an actual place and a space. So you can see, again, there's these candy painted objects referencing my previous works in car culture, again with the holographic vinyl. You've got these brass windows, plexi bar top. These are photographs of some of my dad's friends who were original, patrons of the bar or we kind of call them members of the bar because it feels like such a strong community. And like Rodney Kirby in the front of the photograph was actually able to come to the events at the lab and, you know, see like this photograph and tell stories about the bar, and that kind of, you know, intergenerational connection has been really magical within the bar. There's other moments of the bar that feel more like an altar. The photograph features two of my dad's brothers. So on the left is my Uncle Alvin and then my Uncle Carl, who both helped my dad build out a lot of the bar. He decided that if it was going to be the only Black-owned gay bar, it had to look beautiful. Everything had to be like top-notch, up to code. He put a big window, kind of knocked out the front of the bar and put a window in so that it would be, you know, filled with light and was a place that you would be proud and, you know, want to be seen at. And a lot of other kind of improvements that he did to just really make it a beautiful space. And his brothers, you know, didn't like identify as queer, but they just were like, you know, our brother's doing this bar, let's do it. And I think they really got to know a lot about the community, you know, and were totally became regulars at the bar. And then this photograph features Sammy, whose nickname was Miss Lecreek. Sammy recently passed away, but through my kind of, you know, research and learning more about the bar, my dad really talks about Sammy as kind of like the icon of the bar. And I just love this photograph with like all of the adornment that's going on, this like pink silk top, the apron, the gold, the nails, and yeah, really, I think Sammy has kind of become like the kind of this like iconic character in this story. And I wish I could have met Sammy, but I feel like he's on board and you like feel his spirit sometimes. But really, you know, besides all of the physical elements, which were really important in constructing the story and the space, really when the project is when it's activated and peopled and, you know, is a party. So this is one of my good friends, Redwood Hill, bartending. They have also kind of become one of the faces of the project. They're an artist as well as, you know, chef and bartender and mixologist, and really kind of perform this role of the bartender as like, you know, the person that you want to spill all the tea to, the person that just kind of like is connecting people. And I was just blown away to see how that could happen so organically and easily, you know, at this bar. Like I said, when we built it, it felt like an amazing sculpture, but as soon as people started hanging out, it felt like a temple. And we weren't sure if that was going to happen. You kind of just take a chance, and it worked. You know, probably with like Sammy smiling down and sprinkling some blessings on it. It just it happens. This is my friend Jahari DJing at one of the events with this like gorgeous Sylvester record. This was a flyer for one of the events at the lab that I did with a dear friend, Rashad Pridgeon, aka Soul Nubian. And we were talking about like, you know, making the kind of advertisements and flyers for the event. And we thought we didn't want it to look like an art event. We wanted it to look like a party, you know, like neon pink night at the Eagle Creek. And so there was a lot of moments where you could kind of get into the vernacular of a bar, whether it was with like coasters or matchbooks. We did T-shirts or this like, you know, flyer and thinking about like kind of party nightlife imagery. And then the project went to ICA LA. Rashad also performed there. This is one of the hardest, you know, projects for me to explain. I basically call it a dance ritual, but it was one of those kind of journeys where if you were there, then you know, and if you weren't there, maybe you can catch it another time. But it was very spiritual, kind of out-of-body experience, and Rashad is just like a medium in that way. So grateful that he could perform this masquerade performance a few different times. And then, yeah, this video I think kind of shows what went into making it. This is me and Steven assembling the bar a few days, hours before it opened, in the space at the lab in San Francisco. And then you'll see, like, once it gets done, it gets peopled and it gets crazy. But yeah, I think both like that making and then that like embodying, somehow that video just shows how elaborate both of those parts were. There's also a zine that I made to go with the exhibition and thinking about the different ways that information travels, and you know, these things kind of pop up and then come down at an institution, but this zine, even if it's like just a few stapled together pages, could live kind of forever and live in different places, and maybe someone would see this on someone's coffee table and say, wait, I think the Eagle Creek, I was there. You know, so it was important to get as much ephemera as I have and that my dad kept, which was really not a lot, to get that into the zine. So this is like one example. I'm sorry that link turned from pink to an actual link color, but basically if you're interested in seeing the zine, the Studio Museum did an amazing job of kind of redesigning for the web all the content from the zine. So that's something that's like available for anyone to check out. And yeah, this page is talking about this like new advanced technology of a video game console that was installed at the bar that was, the intention was like a kind of educational safe sex. From what I understand, it was like a kind of choose your own adventure safe sex video game. I would love to see what it looked like and what the graphics were. But yeah, I know my dad was really proud to have it at the bar. And so, and it was sponsored by this organization called the Brothers Network. So, you know, these kind of little moments that really kind of tell you what was going on. And then we took the bar to Pride in 2019 in San Francisco, really as an homage to, you know, my dad participating in Pride in 1992. And it was basically the patrons came together and were like, Rodney, like, we gotta have a float. We have this amazing multiracial community and we don't see that reflected in Pride. You know, it's interesting because I feel like now we have our own new challenges about what we don't see reflected in Pride or what we see being co-opted in Pride. So we definitely wanted to recreate that moment. So we put the whole thing on a truck. It was designed to fit on a truck from the beginning. And we took all the elements from the installation so that it would really hold up as an artwork. And then also all the people who basically had gathered over the course of like, you know, the couple months that the project was up at the lab. People really kind of connected and met each other. And like Bashari and Lawrence, who were in the front, like they hadn't known each other before, but they, you know, throughout like the kind of reoccurring events, people like met and connected, and it really felt when we were at Pride like this was this sort of like, you know, scene or crew that we had developed over the past few weeks and months. So this is like another view of the float. That's Dina Beard from the lab, like cheering with the tote bag on the left, standing on the ground. Then you have like Miss December in the back with the afro and the pink glasses. You got a baby on the float. So I think we had like 8 months to 80 years old on the float. And we partied and had fun. That's my dad on the mic, and behind him, directly behind him is Jamal Batts from the Black Aesthetic Collective, who also presented 2 different times. I just love like the kind of loving intergenerational gaze, and my dad is just like having a great time and kind of beaming. And so then the Eagle Creek went to the kitchen not that long ago, beginning of this year, and a whole another kind of series of magic unfolded. This is Madison Moore, who basically, Legacy Russell, the curator at the kitchen, invited Madison to do a nightlife residency, and Madison basically curated 5 amazing Saturday sessions within my Eagle Creek project and brought so much scholarship and music and vibes and fog machines and wigs and lights. So I'm just gonna like quickly shout out some of the folks that came through to that project. Tiger Paw's set was like a whole personal musical journey through my like young bar days and car ride days and just all of the things. And it's just very flexible, you know, what can happen in this space. And there's just so much variety of these moments that happen, and you kind of realize it's like out of your hands and you've created this, you know, stage, and then the magic is just gonna kind of do its own thing. This is the Black Aesthetic Collective that I mentioned. They screened a bunch of films and archival found, you know, footage. This is some footage from Sylvester's 40th birthday party. And they kind of like read poetry and like kicked it at the bar while also screening these films. And they are definitely Eagle Creek family. And then DJ Nita and the whole like House of Aviance crew came for just like, I don't know, 7 hours of like performance and drag and theater and storytelling and like, you know, kind of impromptu panel discussion. And just it was really cool to kind of see people who have a really big audience and a really big platform but don't necessarily like get to talk about it always, to really just like break down some of the history and, you know, musical moments and club moments that meant a lot to them. So that was fun. And then my father, we always, you know, feel very lucky when we get to just hear directly from him. So we always, you know, try to do a talk with like me and my dad, just kind of having the conversations that led up to me doing this project, because I always wanted to know more and know more. And it's such a blessing that he is with us and gets to tell this story in his own words. I feel like a lot of times these projects don't necessarily happen until, you know, someone's passed away and someone's going through someone's, you know, legacy or papers. And it's just really great to have my dad, you know, be a real partner in this. He's like very charismatic and funny and like gets all the laughs, and I'll be like the serious, you know, one. But it's just, there's like, again, like a texture to it that's just like based on who he is, because he's also like just a person, you know. He's not like an archetype or a symbol or a legend. Like he's a person. Okay, so that is basically where I wanted to end. I did want to mention a project that's up now at SF MoMA, in case anyone happens to be coming through California. And also on the website for this project, there's kind of a lot of content. There's like a library that I curated along with a colleague, Grant Yackel, with a lot of books that I think kind of encapsulate a lot of the things. And 2 of the books that I mentioned are on that list. So if you're interested in like reading more, that library is an interesting place. There's also like an interview and little video that they put on the Space Time website. And this is just a quick shot of what it looks like. We just finished installing this like a couple weeks ago, but it's this big photo mural, which is all kind of flatly printed, and then these small drawings that hang on top of that wall. And then again, one of these pink windows. It's kind of bright, but when you're there, it's like, depending on the time of day, it gets quite dark, and pink light gets cast all over SF MoMA and all over the permanent collection and onto like this Felix Gonzalez Torres curtain, which just kind of blows my mind that I get to do that, and I hope he's cool with that. I definitely feel that the vibe is a match. And yeah, it says Space Time, and God, I feel like Space Time is a good place to end, because it's just like impossibly infinite, as are so many of these things that I'm trying to tackle. But at the same time, you just like keep putting one foot in front of the other and taking these impossible things and trying to make a moment to just even begin to contemplate them or pay respect to them or figure out how we connect and where we can locate ourselves in this crazy space-time continuum. So thank you for this space and your time. I really appreciate it. Thanks.
So I have a comment and a question. My name is Yasmina, and I got to experience the Eagle Creek installation earlier this year in New York.
Oh, wow.
It was so beautiful and moving. Thank you.
Yeah, so it was so beautiful and moving. I came with one of my friends, and one of my favorite parts about the installation was I came for, I think it was a night that Madison Moore had curated, and everybody was sitting around the bar, and every person had to speak about a track in relation to club culture and like how that's influenced them as like DJs, promoters within queer nightlife. And that really moved me because I DJ and organize parties in the city as well. And I don't know, it was just, yeah, very moving. I was there earlier in the year. It was an experience. And also I was wondering too if it's like that conversation is available online, because I know it was recorded, but I'm not sure if there's access.
Well, thank you so much for sharing that. I'm so glad that you were able to experience it in real life. And I love just hearing like, you know, what kind of moment people had or what it brought to them. I feel like especially at that time in New York, you know, we were still pretty kind of deep in pandemic vibes. And for a lot of people I know, it was like just a very needed moment to kind of like party together or be together. See? Thank you. I want to just like breathe that in and store that bit of information from you, because you definitely kind of need those moments to sustain like the harder, boringer moments of the project. But then when I hear that, I'm like, okay, it's worth it.
I feel like it was a beautiful ode to like, you know, you were showcasing like the history of like what queer nightlife was in this specific place, and then to have people in another area who are continuing that legacy and like giving them the platform to do that, it just was so profound. Yeah.
Amazing. Thank you. And yeah, I'm not sure all of which parts are online. I would probably have to look at like the kitchen website to see, or if you follow Madison Moore, like on Instagram, or their website seems very robust, so maybe they put it on there. But it's definitely a good thing to think about, like making some of those conversations available after the fact. So noted. Appreciate you. Thank you. Anything else?
Probably hear me, but I just am curious, what is your favorite color? The question I asked is, what is your favorite color, and is it pink?
I think my favorite color is hologram, which is kind of cheating because it's all the colors. I mean, pink is definitely something that it's like one of my favorite strategies, I guess. It's not that I necessarily like always loved pink or wear that much pink, even though I kind of do. But to me, it's just one of those colors that like people really have a strong reaction to. It's supposed to be like frivolous and not serious, but at the same time, it can command so much attention and change a vibe and like change a room, and some people hate it, and it just like, to me, that it's just a very powerful tool, and so I like to employ it. But it's not like my whole house is pink. And in fact, sometimes I'm like, oh, I can't wear pink because I'm gonna match the show, and that's just like too much sometimes. Yeah, thank you. Anybody else, or y'all want to eat dinner?
Thank you so much, Sadie. Did you do any archival research to find out more about that video game?
You know, I haven't, but somebody got in touch with me recently, and they were doing a project about the history of queer video games. And they wanted to know if I had any more information about the game, which I didn't. But I'm kind of hoping that they will find it, and then we can know more. But yeah, I don't really know where to start, but they sounded like they would know where to start. But then the fact they were asking me means maybe they tried all the other logical channels. So yeah, I don't really know like where that would be. But if anybody has suggestions or wants to go down a research rabbit hole, I would just love to see like what the graphics looked like, you know, in like 1990 in this video game. There's a lot, you know, missing. Like, there's very few photographs that I have of the bar, and I just sort of keep hoping that, like, if I keep on doing this project and keep talking about it, that somebody will come forward and be like, I was a photography student in San Francisco in 1990, and I went to the bar and took all these amazing pictures, and I have the negatives, and, you know. It hasn't happened yet, but I'm just putting that out there, and maybe someone will be like, I made that video game. And I mean, there has been a lot of connections that people have, like, you know, come out of the woodworks. And even my dad has connected with so many friends of that time who found out about the project through reading about it online and then, like, reconnected. So there's definitely been some really cool, you know, stories and things that have come forward, but not as much material as I hope would be out there. But again, some of the things, it's like you just kind of have to imagine it, I think, and that's the point, is like not everything, especially at that time, was documented and posted and like saved. A lot of it just kind of was there and then it wasn't. So kind of being okay with that, I don't know if it's loss or just, you know, impermanence or something, but yeah, I think some of it we'll just have to dream of, which is also why I made the bar look nothing like the original bar, because I just wanted it to feel like a dream and really just let go of like, wait, what color were the walls and, you know, what did it look like? But just like, I feel like whenever you dream about something, you just kind of make it even more grand and amazing than it might have been, but it probably felt that way to the people who like the bar was everything for. So yeah, I think sometimes the lack of information or the lack of things being saved is sad, but it also kind of provides this opportunity to just get a little less literal and a little more fantastical. Thank you guys so much for being here and welcoming me to Minneapolis. I really appreciate it, and I hope to be back soon. So keep in touch.